Welcome to Detonation Point. I'm your host, Matt O'Neill. I was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years and retired as the Deputy Special Agent in charge of the cyber operations part of the Criminal Investigative Division. In Detonation Point, I'm going inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Welcome, everybody, back to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. We have a very special guest and a guest host today. We have a guest hosting Sarah O'Neill, who's the Director of Communications for 50 Consulting, LLC, and the granddaughter of our guest, Jim O'Neill, who spent many, many years with the U.S. Secret Service and the VA OIG. And one of the things that we've talked about is I really want to get more insights from folks that have been in the Secret Service in particular, but also in federal law enforcement going back, a few decades, to really inform folks how it's changed and how either more complex or simpler things were and are today. So with that, welcome both of you guys. And Sarah and I will tag team questions. And we promise not to ask who's your favorite grandchild. So we'll save that for the after podcast. So the first question is, how did somebody growing up in Northeast Philadelphia who went to Father Judge High School and LaSalle find the Secret Service even to begin with? What were you doing before then?
I began working at a supermarket, and that was through college. And when we first got married, that was my first job, was in charge of a supermarket front end, all the cashiers. And I got a job at a reform school, and finally I got a job teaching because I'd gotten my teaching certificate during college. Interestingly enough, my interview for the job occurred on the day we were married. So we were married at 2:00. I had a 9 a.m. appointment to be interviewed by the Philadelphia School District. So the night before, your mother tried to kill me by ramming the car into 3 parked cars. And we were in the hospital till after midnight. And fortunately, nothing's too serious, just a lot of bruises. So I went in for the interview, and they started asking me about my core beliefs about teaching and so forth, which I didn't have any. I just was looking for a job. They said, "How do we know you really want this job?" And I said, "Well, look at my face. I was in the hospital after midnight last night. Secondly, I'm getting married at 2:00 today." And they said, "That's enough. You're hired." So I ended up very high on the list, and I got hired in teaching at Overbrook High School. This was in 1971. Overbrook was mostly known at that time as the alma mater of Wilt Chamberlain. I taught there for a year. The teachers went on strike. We were buying a house. I couldn't afford to not have a job for even weeks. We were living paycheck to paycheck.
How much was the house?
The house was $20,700, which is less than the price of cars today. So we bought it for that amount, and I went to work back at the reform school, and I substituted. That turned out to be a pretty good deal eventually, even though substituting was the most physical job I ever had in terms of fighting. In the beginning, particularly until you got the hang of it, first year or so was every time I taught I had to fight. But this part of my job for reform school was to chase runaways. And I had this old Ford. It was an old police car. And I looked like a wild man. I had a beard. And most of the kids I had were in gangs in Germantown. So I would pick them up if they were runaways and throw them in the car, and their friends wouldn't see them again. And that word spread in the schools I was teaching in. So they would say, "Don't mess with him. He took JJ and we never saw him again." I don't know if they thought I was a homicidal maniac. But anyway, the Secret Service came along. Thank God. I applied to a variety of places. I was waiting to be hired by the Philadelphia Police Department. And I just applied on a whim to a variety of federal agencies. It wasn't as if I thought they would be hard up enough to hire me in the Secret Service. I thought I was way too unqualified, but they did. And so I started in January 76.
Did you know anybody that was in federal law enforcement beforehand? How did you even know to apply and where to apply?
I just did some research. I applied to ATF, Customs, DEA, and Secret Service. It wasn't as if I had any to my knowledge. I was interviewed the day that Squeaky Farm tried to kill Ford. they were ramping up for the 76 campaign, and they were behind the 8 ball in hiring. So they clearly lowered their standards enough for me to get on.
I think the listeners are going to be, wait a second. Two things. He said his best attributes as a teacher was fighting, and he was ICE ERO in the 70s. He's just picking people off the streets and you never see him again. What? Could you just give a little bit so people aren't curious as to the landscape of fighting? Can you describe the reform school life? Was there any teaching going on?
Yeah, I taught at the reform school. That was the easiest place in the world to teach. And the kids, when they were separated from their environment and given structure, they really responded. And they were, by and large, really good kids. They were allowed to go home periodically for weekend visits. So you could hold that over their head if they were out of line or whatever. I didn't have any problems in the reforms. The problems were in teaching in the substitute role in the Philadelphia public schools. I went to my first assignment. I was in Lower Fishtown, which now is a hip spot to be in, but back then it was anything but. It was very, very violent. Everybody involved had issues, and there was fighting a lot. It was just mayhem. So I'm teaching my first class, and I made the rookie mistake of turning my back to write my name on the board, and somebody threw a stone at the board and then came up and took a swing at me. And this is as I'm introducing myself. So then I subdued him, and then we continued on. And now this is a kid that was at the verge of dropping out. He had motorcycle gang colors on. He had a chain around his arm. This was not some innocent little kid. And he was very happy, impressed that I beat him. And I didn't beat him like in any significant way, I just subdued him. So the next class I'm teaching, and a brick comes flying through the window. It shatters the window. I'm the only one who reacts. These kids are pretty much used to it. So then I leave, and I see there's a cordon of police officers that have to provide protection for the Black and Puerto Rican kids, because this school was in a white neighborhood. And the kids had to walk through this cordon to get to the buses so they wouldn't be literally killed. There was a kid killed there the year before by a gang of white kids. The department head handed me a nightstick and says, "You're going to need it. These kids are wild, and I want you to just hit them in the effing head with this stick if they give you any trouble." That's a little different than today's.
Yes, Sarah, did you have that at Bedford High School in New Hampshire?
No, can't say I did.
So I go in, and and he told me this one class I'm going to have is being studied by the University of Pennsylvania for the level of dysfunction is hard to believe. And I somehow controlled them 40 minutes with the promise that I would turn on his TV. And there was actually a TV in the room, which was new to me. I didn't know schools had TVs. And that was another rookie mistake, because the place broke out into a fight. I mean, like everybody's fighting everybody else. And that department head comes in with his nightstick, and he's swinging it. And he says, "I gave you that effing nightstick, now use it." So that was my introduction to teaching. So one school I taught at, the vice principal was shot in the head. Another school I taught, the substitute had been locked in a room, and the room set on fire. So it was a unbelievable environment. The safety of the Secret Service was really appealing to me.
How long did it take from application to getting hired in those days?
It was in September for my interview, and I was hired in December to start in January.
So it was like 4 months. Wow.
Yeah.
Did they have polygraphs?
No.
Okay. How many interviews did you do?
Just 2.
Just an initial and a panel?
There was no panel. I interviewed with the agent in charge, Jim D'Amelio, who recently passed away. And then I was interviewed by a senior agent, and it was more of a filling out forms interview, if I recall correctly, and their version of a polygraph. Did you ever do this? So it was.
You sure?
So that's the best of my recollection. There were no panels yet.
Did they do the Larry David stink eye? Or just to see if you're telling the truth? All right. So then you get hired in January. How long between the day you get hired do you go to FLETC? And then how long between FLETC and Secret Service School?
1 week is when I was hired, and was leaving town for FLETC a week later.
Did you have a roommate?
Oh, yeah. Back then, you always had a roommate. That didn't end until the Ockberg study, which was in 79. And that revealed that that was a major morale issue. Everywhere you went, you doubled up protection wherever.
And when you were doubled up on protection, somebody's working midnight, somebody's working days. So not everybody's, or did it not matter? They were just like, hey, you two guys have a room, figure it out.
Generally, it was the latter. Occasionally, you could work it out, particularly if you had a bunch of guys from the same office on an assignment. The other problem is sleep patterns are so different, that somebody getting off midnights may not want to go to bed till 4 o'clock in the afternoon to wake up and go to work.
Yeah.
Me, on the other hand, couldn't wait to get to sleep as soon as I get off work at midnight.
How many times was it just one bed?
Fortunately, never to my record.
For those that aren't in this field, can you explain the difference between FLETC and then like Secret Service school?
Yeah, at least from back then, I can explain it. FLETC was a generalist type of training for law enforcement. Think of detectives versus uniformed officer training. So this would be more of a detective type based training. And it was very general. You learned primarily constitutional law, and there was a lot of physical fitness training, not so much, if I recall correctly, defensive tactics. That was much more so in Secret Service school. And you learned rules of evidence, basically Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues. Everybody learned on a revolver. And in the Secret Service, for a good bit of my career, I had a revolver rather than a pistol. So the training, that was a key part of it. And FLETC at that time was not even a year away from being a naval air station. And it didn't have the amenities that it had, say, when you went through, Matt. And all our ranges were outdoor. And the food was, I always describe it as fried everything. I think we were there for roughly 8 weeks. We weren't allowed to bring cars. We came to Washington before we went to FLETC and met the director and the director's staff. And then later that day, we boarded a plane for FLETC, and then that's where you remained. So you didn't really get off campus. So that was FLETC. Secret Service was roughly the same time, 8 weeks, give or take at that time. I know it's longer now. And that focused in on the job of the Secret Service. So a lot of protection was taught, counterfeiting, check forgery, protective intelligence interviews, and defensive tactics. Although, if I recall correctly, every move ended in a chokehold. Eventually, you couldn't use chokehold. So that all changed in the early 80s. At FLETC, you had to live on campus. But in the Secret Service, you were free at that time, at least, to live on the economy. So,
but no roommates then.
Your mother was my roommate.
And then you graduate, and the cases that you were working in those days. Give the listeners a flavor of the type of cases and how complex they were.
Complex in those cases shouldn't be used in the same sentence. My first year was consumed a lot by training and by the campaign. In 1976, there were a lot of protectees and there were a lot of protection assignments through that year. So I was parked in what was called the bond squad. So I came home and told your mother I'd been assigned to the bond squad. She heard bomb and freaked out. Like, you don't know how to disarm a bomb? I said, it's a savings bond. So basically, that squad was responsible for savings bond forgeries, reproductions. But in any event, right after that year, I was paired up with Jack Lewis, who is the father-in-law of your brother now. So these binds are deep. But anyway, we were partners for a year. So we were in a check squad. So to give you some sense of what it was like back then, we were handed brown envelopes. And maybe you've heard that phrase.
Yeah, I was getting them. Yep.
And basically, it was a check forgery case where they had an image of a check, front and back. But the bottom line is you knew it was stolen and forged, and it was your job to go out and figure out who did it. And we would get probably in the neighborhood of 60 cases. Some folks had more and some fewer, and it depended on the zip codes. Everything was assigned back in Philadelphia. I can only describe Philadelphia. I don't know what it was like in a smaller office. But in Philadelphia, you had squads. So you had the check squad was the largest by far. And then counterfeit squad was more an aspirational for when you were new. You wanted to make it into the counterfeit squad. And then you had the bond squad, as I described, the rubber gun squad, as we used to call it. The PI squad. They worked purely protective intelligence cases, interviewing subjects that threaten the president. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's it. And the office was probably about 70 agents. And back then, you could smoke in the office. And that had to die out pretty quickly in the 70s. But when I started, there were people smoking in the offices. You don't really think much of it. But I think the office Jack and I had, we shared with about 6 other agents. And everybody had a phone, and everybody's talking to everybody, witnesses, victims, lining up interviews, that sort of thing. So it was cacophony of sound in a room. And then you had a private room where you could interview someone. Like I said, you had 50 cases each. You were partnered up, and you basically made your case, and you made your arrests, pretty much just the two of you. Again, it wasn't really whodunits. You basically came up with suspects pretty quickly most of the time. And if possible, you tried to flip some of the suspects so they could work it off with becoming an informant and getting better cases as a result. And you're always looking to get counterfeit cases out of it. But, sometimes if you could work your way into a check fence who was dealing with thousands of dollars of checks. Some of these cases were, $150 checks. And we were investigating this and arresting people. And there were months that we arrested 15 people. There was an expectation, 2 and 20, 2 arrests, 20 closed cases.
A month?
A month.
Yep.
And most closed cases ended in arrests. Basically, you're always aiming to arrest 100 people a year. And that may sound outrageous today, because I know how difficult it is to work through U.S. Attorney's Office and deal with complex investigations and make 100 arrests a year. It doesn't happen that way anymore. The bottom line was, you had statutes that you were limited to investigate. And I don't remember all the numbers, but 495, I think, was check forgery and uttering. Uttering is actually trying to cash a check after it's been forged. And that was the felony. And then there was 1701 was obstruction of the mail. So the way you ran all these cases through and not bogged down district court, everything went through a magistrate hearing. And the bottom line is, almost all these cases resulted in a guilty plea to the misdemeanor. They were charged with a felony and a misdemeanor, but they pled to the misdemeanor, generally 6 months or less, if anything, and restitution, which I'm sure, we didn't follow up on that. So it was that sort of world. I mean, you were constantly working the street. You were not welcome in the office. If you were in the office, his boss wanted to know why you were there. Obviously, you had to write up your reports. And if you were in the office because you were bringing somebody to court that day, which happened a lot, of course, then that was fine. But they didn't want you just hanging out there. You wanted to be on the street. Again, that's probably a change, because there were no computers, there was no internet, none of that stuff. So it wasn't as if you could get anything of value by being in the office like you can today.
Yeah, it's the same and different. We used to always just say, if you're out in the streets, you're probably out meeting people. You should be working with other agencies, whether it's federal, state, and local law enforcement. You can't build rapport. You can't build collaboration from behind your desk. And quite honestly, and now with laptops, I don't need to be sitting at my desk in order to work a case. And the reality is, probably the worst supervisors are the ones that only thing they understand is managing people's time and where they are. And, you have to be here from this time to this time. But it doesn't matter what you do. So probably the better supervisors are the ones that recognize that this job is 24/7, 365. So wherever you are, you probably are doing something to forward a case. So when you were trying to do 2 arrests, 20 closed cases, what was the volume of protection during that time frame as well?
It was low enough to be a welcome diversion. You always had the United Nations General Assembly work in September-ish. But beyond that was foreign digs. So when I started Ford, that was the campaign year. So that was totally different. Once Carter came in, the number of visits were small enough, as I said. It was the only way you could make any overtime. So it was kind of welcome to get this. It was not disruptive to investigations by and large. And of course, these investigations, particularly in check squad, were fine if you interrupted them. No big deal.
From your perspective, how do you think working all of those cases helped as you progressed in your career as it relates to protection?
I probably conducted far more interrogations than agents do today because I worked in an area that were like 20 blocks one way and 30 blocks another way, if that. And you were bouncing around. It was just constant movement and constant interviews. And that was one thing. Secondly, to get cooperation, you weren't afraid of anything, basically. You didn't afraid to ask. You were going into bars and yanking people out of them. You were shooting galleries, what they used to call it, where heroin was being shot by a number of people. And so you were very used to getting your own way. I guess that's the bottom line. And when you were dealing with a suspect, you said, come with me. You just got used to being assertive without being a jerk. Because if you were a jerk, then you had problems on the street too. You always wanted, in my opinion, always wanted to treat people as well as allow you to treat them. And I think that worked pretty well. So you had developed some self-confidence. And when it came to protection, then when you had to ask the hotel owner, we want to freeze your elevators off of our floor, you did it in a manner where you got their cooperation. And I worked a lot with the Philadelphia police too. And on check cases, we used to get something called regiscope photos. Did you ever have that, Matt?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Is that still something that people do? Okay. Yeah. So it basically just a photograph of a suspect cashing a check. So sometimes you didn't know who it was because say they had hit a mail relay box or they had just stolen from a bunch of housing project, a bunch of mail slots or whatever. So you would get to know the officers in the area you worked, and you would show them photos, and they would sometimes give you some information that they were hearing this or that. Developed a very positive relationship with the police department, which was critical in protection because you couldn't do protection without local law enforcement.
No, I agree. I think the two things that people overlook when they talk about, oh, well, the Secret Service shouldn't have a investigative mission is they underestimate the relationships that we develop with the local police department to ask them to do things that cost them a lot of money and they don't need necessarily to do it. So when I was in New Hampshire and Connecticut dealing with small police departments, we got to know them because we were out with them, again, not being in your office, but being out with them nearly daily basis. So when something came up, whether it was a protection assignment or a protective intelligence case, we already had those relationships. And if you don't have those relationships, good luck asking a police department to shut down a street for, hours at a time and providing all of their resources. So that's a critical element. And if you get rid of that, then that's going to be a lot more problematic. The other piece is developing the ability to engage with the general public and with businesses and with your law enforcement partners. Exactly to your point, how do you, in a professional way, coerce them to go along with what you need in order to get the job done? And so I've never believed this nonsense that a good protection agent could be a good investigative agent. But I always do believe that a really good investigative agent will make a good protective agent because, quite honestly, I don't think protection's terribly hard, but you have to have a degree of self-confidence. And you also have to be able to talk to people. It's probably the most critical skill that's overlooked. At least I think so.
I think you're right. And also it came to mind that when I think back to the criminal investigations and the number of interrogations I conducted, you were always getting people to act against their own self-interest in a way. So that helps in protection quite a bit. And again, It's not beating somebody up or anything. It's convincing someone to cooperate. Yeah. And so I think that is another thing that crosses barriers.
And I think that the landscape has changed a little bit from the 70s to today, whereas in your protective intelligence cases or any of your sort of threat cases, you have to understand how the internet works and you have to understand how to follow leads. And you do that because the service now is focused on cyber-enabled financial crime, in which the internet is probably part of every single case. So if somebody sends in a threatening email or somebody posts something on Twitter or Instagram, whatever, you have to follow those leads. And if you don't understand how to get the necessary information, whether it's IP address, user agent string information, all of that kind of stuff that you get, you're never going to be able to close that gap. And those are perishable skills because things change. Apple changes their requirements as to how they hold encrypted information in iCloud accounts. And again, the engagement with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm a firm believer that the U.S. Secret Service is a federal law enforcement agency. They're not in the intel community. And you follow the Constitution. And by doing so, you engage with the U.S. Attorney's Office. You don't do something outside of DOJ. And in doing so, working criminal cases, a lot of them really sets you up nicely in order to handle whatever you need to do on the protective intelligence side.
Yeah, as you can imagine, with the number of arrests that we were making, you got to know the AUSAs really well. You're able to, you gain their trust, and they will back you up. We prepared our own complaints. I doubt that was something that's still being done. And you would take it over, they would sign off on it, you walk to a magistrate. To give you some sense of how quickly things evolved back then compared to now, which I was given a case in the morning, a brown envelope with an altered check that I went out that morning, got a confession, took the person in, knowing that I could get an AUSA to sign off on a complaint, took him to court that afternoon. He pled out that day, was sentenced, and I wrote the closing memorandum that afternoon. So, I mean, that's really laughable now, but
yes,
back then, now believe me, that was an exception to the rule. But it was conceivable back then that you could solve something in a day. And we did probably more crimes in progress, arrests, probable cause arrests than maybe agents get the opportunity to do today. Because you had cooperating check cashers who would notify you. And we were so close to them, you could get there in 2 or 3 minutes and arrest them in the act. And so you had to have the confidence of the U.S. Attorney's Office to sign off then, or otherwise you had to unarrest them. And you didn't want that.
No.
Although I'm not saying it was without precedent. And that's another thing. I mean, I remember running out on one of those with another agent, and there were 5 guys out there, and we only had 2 sets of cuffs. I remember using a belt to tie hands on one of them. And then we ended up having to unarrest 4 of them. I was laughing earlier because the 70s, Miranda was still relatively new at the time. And the Supreme Court kept coming out with decisions that required you to pay attention to this, or you would lose the confession or whatever it is you've seized. But it was not the same as it is now. And even into the 80s, things changed. It was less Wild West than it was particularly in the 70s when it came to paying attention to all that. And most of the people pled, so it wasn't as if you had many hearings about admissibility and all that.
So I think it's interesting to have multi-generational panel of Secret Service agents here. So every decade has its own set of unique challenges. In your opinion, what do you think was the biggest challenge that the agency faced in the 70s? And Dad, if you want to jump in afterwards, do you think that those challenges still echoed in your era, or if the landscape was completely different by the time that you joined?
I don't recall challenges in the 70s other than sharing a room everywhere you went. That was an unpleasant challenge. And the protection responsibilities weren't so onerous as they became later. Technology really didn't exist. I mean, basically our cameras were Polaroids. It wasn't as if you were issued one. You had to go get one if you thought you needed it that day. Search warrants for properties, not information. So you didn't have many of them, to be honest, because you got consent searches so often. Again, when you think about the impact, though, that the Secret Service has now on true economic losses, and it's not just the Secret Service. I saw this at the VA OIG. We were dealing with multi-million-dollar cases, and I know from that the Secret Service was and is now. In that world, it's totally different than what I experienced. The Secret Service in the 80s had responsibility for credit cards, so that was a new line of business, and I never experienced that because I never made it back to the field despite repeated attempts. So I didn't get too exposed to criminal offenses till I went to the VA OIG, and there it was a totally different environment. We had homicide cases, sexual assaults, this standard bribery, procurement fraud, you name it, and in large dollar amounts. And therefore, you had to understand the cases could take a year or 2 years or longer to get through prosecution. And there wasn't much that you could do to speed that up. And that wasn't my world. My world was over, in a couple days. And now counterfeiting, though, that's another thing that's changed. I mentioned earlier, I was a cashier in the 60s, and there weren't credit cards yet. So everybody paid their bill with cash. Sometimes people wrote a check, but by and large, it was cash. So you got a sense for the feel of money more so when you were dealing with it every day. And there was more counterfeiting going on, I suspect, particularly the mom and pop passes of supermarkets and wherever, because it was a way of buying something, cash. It was the only way, really. So I was thinking about that earlier, that's another big change. I don't know, Matt. I know even when you started, you weren't dealing with professional printers using typographic printing to manufacture counterfeit money. You were dealing with computer-generated notes.
Largely, there was some, like the New York Counterfeit Squad would be responsible and would work a lot of the cases coming out of Colombia,
Yes.
or they worked obviously the Supernote case. Well, the service did out of the North Korea or the Israeli note. There were some bills in those days that were sort of the non we used to call them computer generated or P notes, but largely, yeah, we were working P note cases, and it was typically opportunistic. Garbage kind of bills that were passed. Going back to pull on a couple threads that Sarah asked, the makeup of the agents back in the 70s, were they, I have this impression that primarily Vietnam vets, or is that, and local cops? What was the makeup? Obviously it was largely probably white male, but where did most of the recruits come from?
Particularly in 76, there was a real mixture of people. It wasn't, there were many military veterans. I wouldn't say it was exclusively Vietnam veterans. There were plenty of Vietnam veterans, of course, and there were many prior law enforcement, mostly uniformed law. But there were more than a sprinkling of people from other fields that came into it. Yes, in terms of racially, I would say it was white and then gender male. Among our 70 agents, I can remember 3 or 4 female agents. I think only one of them actually retired. That's another thing, it's very different. I'm sure it was a more difficult assignment for a female agent back then than it is today, I hope.
So then the other question is, so you start in 76. Talk about the people that were 20-year veterans of the agency then. So that would have been people that would have been there during the Eisenhower administration, through the Kennedy assassination, through Johnson. And what are some stories that you remember that they were telling going back? Because obviously we span 50 years. When you first started, you spanned from the 50s all the way through. Anything stand out about how their lives were different than your lives? Like everybody always says, oh, we have it easier than the previous generation, or the generation says we had it a lot harder than the guys now. What about those early folks that you came across that were the veterans of those days?
Okay, well, the vast majority of people I worked with in 76 were new people. They weren't very senior at all. Senior agent was a rarity, and generally they didn't really talk to you. So it wasn't that they were sharing a lot of stories. And in my current role now with the pipeline, I've talked to a lot of people from that era and learned a lot more. But in terms of the office I was in, the SAC and ASAC were pre-Kennedy, but they were both primarily criminal investigators and they weren't on the detail at the time. So they weren't telling any of those stories. There really wasn't much information passed to us about anything, basically.
Well, because I do remember talking to you about the guys that were in during World War II and how they would get transferred down to D.C. They'd have to sleep in the White House and work counterfeit cases and protect, at that time, Roosevelt.
I didn't learn that from anybody firsthand. I've read about that. But in terms of firsthand, and this doesn't go that far back, but in 68, after Robert Kennedy was killed, then candidates were assigned protection. And once you were assigned, you were there until the candidate dropped out or the election was over. So some folks I worked with back then, they were on the detail for months and rarely had an opportunity to get home. So that was much more difficult than 72, if I'm not mistaken. They went out for 60 days at a time. In 76, it was 30 days. When I went out in 80 with Howard Baker, it was 21 days. And I only had one rotation because he dropped out of the race. But yeah, the uncertainty of going out in June and not knowing if you'll see your family until November was certainly more difficult. Not to mention, and again, the stories back then that I've heard more recently, you get transferred on a Friday, report to Washington on Monday, and it's on you. And the government wasn't buying your house. And I don't even know if they were being reimbursed for real estate fees back then. And the per diem was far less. Even when I started, if I recall correctly, the per diem was $24 a day. So
No matter where you were?
no matter where you were. And so therefore, New York wasn't the greatest place to go, whereas Topeka, Kansas, you could do pretty well on $24 a day.
Is that why you like Tad's Steakhouse so much?
That goes back further. I'm just trying to think of Sarah's question, the difficulties. Again, I can't think of anything. I just love coming to work every day in the 70s and being so grateful that I had this job.
I think from my time stemming from 98 to 2023, I'll focus on the latter because I think in the beginning it was somewhat of a simpler time, and we'll just say that's pre-social media. And the two things that I think that really challenged the agency is one, moving over to the Department of Homeland Security outside of Treasury and having to compete for budget and resources, and they did not do a particularly good job of that. So when you're looking at how the agency has grown budget-wise, it hasn't been until relatively recently that the budget had caught up to, at least to some degree, or getting closer to what the needs of the agency are. And same thing with personnel. And so from the perspective of keeping people, I think probably your generation didn't move to other agencies very much, where now it's very easy to switch. And I'm friends with one of the senior executives from the DEA, and he said, yeah, basically every time that there's an openings, we get a ton of Secret Service. And I know when you were at the VA OIG, they get a ton of Secret Service. And then the Secret Service is getting a ton of people, at least from what I hear from these other agencies. Because when I started in 98, I knew I was going to be there until 2023. And I knew that, and if you ask me any time along the way, and now that's not necessarily the case. You can move between agencies. It's kind of like in college basketball and football now, like you can move from schools, you can move from agencies. So you kind of have to do a much better job of taking care of your people to build a better quality of life. And what's really crushing the agency is the amount of protectees they have and the level of protection that they are requiring because of their mission. People are on the road way too much. So if you're on the road 60, 70% of the time, you're not doing any investigations. You can just forget about that, which I think that's not really all that critical as much anymore. But when you're thinking, well, I'm making this amount of money and I could go to HSI, DEA, FBI, and I don't have to be on the road during a campaign year all that time. And I don't have to work nights, weekends, holidays. I can go somewhere else and still have a much better quality of life and keep my job. That's really tough. So two things. One is bringing in the technology that requires less human beings at protective sites, and then getting more people or parsing down the number of protectees that we have. The agency has done a good job of bringing on, and this is where I push back on anybody that says the agency shouldn't do investigations. Largely the best investigators right now in the agency are not agents. They're analysts that are full-time on problem looking at, Russian-speaking transnational organized criminal groups that are doing ransomware attacks, or crypto investment scam syndicates operating out of Southeast Asia in which you're tracking digital assets, cryptocurrency. They have some of the best in the world. And if you eliminated them from the from the agency, the problem that you're going to have is when you're doing an investigation into a threat, who's going to be doing that? It's all about following the money. So if you're trying to identify the assets of somebody that is a would-be assassin and their money is in the blockchain, who's going to be following that? Who's going to be doing the analysis of their communications through emails, through Signal, through WhatsApp, through all that stuff? It's really, really important to do that. And then the last part is the social media. I've said a lot that social media is probably the worst thing that's happened to society and, in going back hundreds of years. because it has created the ability to just say whatever the hell you want. And it's really sort of broken, in my view, this country apart to a degree, which has created a huge onslaught of comments about protectees. And that is a challenge, will remain a challenge for the agency. And also even standing post, or that you would just have to, and good agents had always done it, but you always have to assume that somebody is filming you all the time, 24/7, 365. So the last thing is getting good quality people to go into federal law enforcement right now. It is a challenge to do it as a career. They might do it for a few years and then move on, but to do it for a career is more of a challenge ever, because the ability to make money in the private sector and the ability to do something at another agency, it can be really, really tempting. Because also when you have spouses that work and then you have to get transferred because the agency needs people for protection, you're going to lose a lot of people, because if I'm in Pittsburgh and my spouse has a really good job, but now I have to move, I have a decision to make. Can I slide over to another agency or do I move? And that's always going to be a challenge. I know, and I appreciate the senior leadership right now is looking at other ways to handle these responsibilities and challenges that probably in the 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s really weren't something to be concerned about.
Yeah, you hit a good point. I mean, when I think back to people I worked with in the 70s, again, most were male and most were married, and virtually none of the wives worked. They were taking care of kids at home. And you have to make a decision now. If your spouse is making much more than you are, is it really worth staying with this? There were no OIGs yet. There were plenty of jobs available in the recent 20 years that weren't available in the 70s. And then plus there was a better retirement system, but very few people left the service when I was there. The retention rate was extraordinarily high, and it became real problematic. And as you mentioned, I saw that at the VA OIG. We didn't recruit any of them, but probably we hired 30 to 40 Secret Service agents, and most of them have done extremely well in their careers at the VA OIG. And I don't know the answers. I mean, you're hitting on some of them. Protection was very different back then too. We only had the president, vice president, and their families, and then you had foreign dignitaries. And that was pretty much it. Secretary of Treasury had one or two people, and there were no mags yet. So, which was a very dangerous environment when you think about it. We weren't permitted to use mags yet. If you had an event, if you were searching people, I remember Ted Kennedy won the Pennsylvania primary and was doing an advance for his celebration the night of the election, and basically just told the guys on post to give people pat down. Can you imagine that today, as opposed to walking through a mag? So again, it's very different. I'm glad I served when I served.
Do you have any stories that are most memorable throughout the time that you worked, or that have stuck with you even into retirement?
I did a number of undercover assignments, and they were just check cases. I never could elevate it to get anybody to sell me kind of money. But I do remember one time I was meeting these two guys in a park near downtown Philadelphia. And as I'm walking to them, a transmitter, which is taped on, fell down my leg as I'm entering the park. I was too close to them. I thought they saw him. So I started limping to avoid this. And I get up, and one of these two guys has a bad limp. And it gave tremendous opportunity to bond with this guy. And he wanted to know how I hurt myself. And I figured, well, he's a city guy, and I'm from the city. And I said skiing, because I figured he'd never skied, because I never skied. And he fell for that. And I was supposed to be a bank employee, so it was more believable. When I went to the counterfeit squad, unfortunately, maybe fortunately for the city, but for me, it wasn't. There really wasn't much activity. Philadelphia had some organized crime counterfeiting back in the earlier 70s. And once they suffered some major arrests by the Secret Service, and they got into other areas that were more rewarding and made them less vulnerable than having to distribute counterfeit money. But I did work a case that, and so did many other agents, that didn't mean much to me then, but did subsequently, which the mall passer. Matt, I don't know if you heard of this case, but there was a fellow who was unknown at the time that was passing notes in malls around the country, and he may pass a note maybe 20 in a particular mall, say in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and the next day passed another 20 in northern Alabama. And there was a lot of work in headquarters trying to figure whether this was a pilot who could make those kind of jumps that quickly. And I ran out some notes at this one mall.
And when you say notes, counterfeit notes is Federal Reserve notes, so we just say notes.
Yeah, counterfeit
Right.
20s they were. And he would target young women working retail and initially we just thought, well, maybe the older people would be more suspicious of him. But in any event, we had already had some drawings from other victims, and the people I interviewed were primarily young, and several of them told me how creeped out they felt around this guy. And they remembered that more than what he bought. Anyway, I had moved down to DC in 82, and I think in 83, they caught this guy in a mall in Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken. And then subsequent searches in action not far from where we live in Manassas revealed that he was a multiple sexual predator. And although I don't know if he was convicted for the homicides, but I'm certain he committed them. And you didn't know that when you're working it. So in retrospect, that was real meaningful. Not that my work added to anything. It just confirmed, his appearance. And then subsequently, because every office was told to go all the malls in their area with the drawings, to talk to every store that you could and leave drawing with them. I was on Reagan's detail for 3 years, and that was great. I didn't like protection because I found it pretty boring, but to be on that detail was wonderful because he was such a great protectee. In terms of stories, one that sticks in my mind being there when Elie Wiesel came to speak with Reagan before a trip to Germany, where the president had agreed to the request of the German chancellor to visit a cemetery. And they didn't realize that this cemetery would have some SS soldiers buried there. And that became obvious when the snow melted and they saw the grave markings. And there was a lot of pressure not to do it. And that was a very moving day for the president, but he felt he committed to it. And I remember that day in particular in the White House. We used to say you're given feet. You're just getting through each day. Most of that work is pretty boring, except when you're doing your protective advances, when all this pressure is on you and you want to make sure everything's in order, everything's accounted for. And that was more challenging. And then later in my career, when I became a detail leader for foreign digs, I almost knocked over Michael Jackson running up a fire escape in a fire where he was evacuating down. I was checking the stairwell before we evacuated the protectee from the 55th floor of a hotel in New York. I met O.J. Simpson in a bar while protecting some President Sinatra. I drove Frank Sinatra and President Reagan through the streets of Hoboken. The crowd was out in the streets banging on the window. They were so excited because Sinatra hadn't returned apparently since he left town and made it big. And of course, Reagan always drew a crowd. And the agent responsible for the motorcade asked his counterpart, "Where are the barricades?" And he told me that the cop told him, "They're right behind the people, jerk." Anyway, I certainly have nothing but good memories about my time there. And fortunately at the VA OIG, really enjoyed that job too. So I've been blessed with 2 careers I really enjoyed.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. To wrap this up, for anyone listening that's considering going into this career, this field, perhaps even next generation in our own family, do you have any advice for someone that's starting out today that you wish that you had been given?
I think that if you want a career where things change all the time, law enforcement could be that career. But if you're going in for your ego, then find some other work to do. The friends you make, it makes it wonderful. I'm still in contact with so many people I worked with in 1976, and that's a blessing. The other advice I'd say is make sure you start contributing to TSP as soon as you start working.
Yeah, the retirement.
Start thinking about your retirement.
One piece of advice that you gave me when I first started, I started in New Haven and we were spending a lot of time in New York, is know where all the good bathrooms are.
Yeah, and that's become increasingly important as you age.
You don't realize it until you're working 12-hour midnights and you have very limited opportunity to use the bathroom. But the advice was hotel ballrooms. And then you at one point used to be able to tell me which hotels had the best bathrooms, the ones that had the floor to ceiling doors, which ones were the cleanest, which ones were open, but it was typically the ballrooms. Go near the ballrooms and you'll find the quietest, cleanest bathrooms.
What is this valuable career advice?
Believe me, when you need it, it is. There's probably nothing more valuable than if you drank 6 cups of coffee because you're working a 12-hour midnight shift and it's 2:30 and nature calls. Hopefully you listen to this podcast and you've done your due diligence on where you had to go to the bathroom because that's important.
I don't want to forget to say how important it is to become well-versed with modernity, being comfortable with computers. Computers are a vital tool now, the way I can't think of a comparable thing back in the day that was anywhere near as important.
I would say probably most people coming on are digitally native because they grew up with it. There's the great story, and I don't know who the agent was, but in the 80s, they're doing an advance in Seattle, and the president's going to Microsoft, and the person's doing the advance is spending 5-6 days with Bill Gates. And the whole time Bill Gates is talking about how you need to know about computers, how you got to get involved in computers, how you have to invest in computers, and computers are the future. And he says, so I bought a computer, which obviously if he spent that money on Microsoft stock, that's what Bill Gates was trying to tell him is invest in it. Don't just buy a computer. But probably most people now are much more digitally native. My generation's probably the last that remembers when, you brought home that computer that had the floppy disks that was down in the basement and we were playing Where in the World in Carmen Sandiego and like all that stuff. When I was still in the service, there were people that say, oh, I don't work cyber cases. That means you just don't work cases because you're not going to find a case that doesn't have some sort of cyber nexus to it at all. So yeah, no, I definitely agree.
Also, you can get all kinds of leads, right, Matt? I mean, you can find, you can find people.
Oh, gotcha.
And that was something that was alien to us. It was nothing like that.
That's what made the job a little easier is because you can find people's social media profiles. You can build out relationships. The network analysis is a lot easier because if I'm trying to build a conspiracy and my defendants are saying they don't know each other, but yet they've tagged each other for the last 15 years on some sort of social media, you're going to be able to know that. You're also able to track people. When I was in our global operations center, we were tracking international fugitives because their wives or girlfriends or both were posting where they were online. And that didn't happen in the 70s. The mall passer wasn't putting stuff out on Instagram or on TikTok or whatever. So having that in your disposal is important. The things that I always tell people that are considering a career in federal law enforcement is you're never going to make a ton of money. Even at the last year, the highest money I ever made in a year is probably the equivalent to a 2-year guy at Salesforce selling software. So you're never going to make a ton of money, but you're never going to have better experiences. And I enjoyed every single day. I was there for 25 years. Find another job where you can say that. And also the relationships, as you mentioned, the people that I talk to almost every single day are people that I've known since the 90s because of the job, because it builds a esprit de corps that you don't get in many other places, because all of those other federal agencies, while they work together, they're not spending nights, weekends, holidays away for several weeks at a time. I remember doing advances in China on Easter Sunday. You still talk to guys about some of those crazy stories from, visiting places like Kazakhstan and Iraq during the war, like all these other kind of things. You don't get that anywhere else. The amount of people that you can touch and network. The other thing about the service, and I'm sure it's probably similar in other federal law enforcement agencies, are you can go a decade without seeing somebody, but when you see them, it's like that decade didn't happen. And so it's probably a very rewarding job. I don't care about the protectees. You did your job and that's it. It was the people. So when people are, posting about pictures of them and stuff, I always felt like I was furniture. I had nothing to do with anything that was happening at any international level. You just happen to be there. Always fascinated by the people that are actually making the events and not just sort of there adjacent. But that doesn't diminish what we do. I just think that there are some people that are just taking this opportunistic sort of look. And to what was said earlier is about their own egos, where you can't have this on this job. You're living somebody else's life. And once you've kind of come to terms with that, then it's probably the most rewarding job you could probably ever have, not financially, but from a perspective of looking back on your life. What did you do? And did you contribute something on both the investigative and the protection side? On the investigative side, scams are at an epidemic level. It's billions of dollars lost every year. There's not many other federal agencies right now that are really focused on scams. Postal Inspection Service is probably the closest, Postal IG and some others, but generally the FBI is not focused on it. HSI is not focused on it. The administration has given them other priorities. So to me, that is something where you can really help out a lot of people that need you the most because they have no one else to call and their life savings has been lost. And in my career, the most rewarding times are when you're able to do that and help people. We recovered about $700 million in stolen money in the 5 years I was in the Global Operations Center. I don't really have anything to do with it. It was all the people working there, but that you've helped people for the rest of their lives.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to hear your career in the Secret Service in the 70s. I learned a lot. I also loved having both perspectives of what it was like in the 70s and then what it was like in the late 90s to early 2000s. Even right now, it's been really great. So thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Anytime I can see my granddaughters. Time well spent.
Do you have any questions that are pressing now that you can ask?
Now that I can hear them, is Allie still grandmom's favorite?
No, I know you guys have that perception. The firstborn is always a unique experience, but no, I think, she obviously has a favorite son, but Jimmy knows that. But, no, she doesn't really. I know you guys think that, but she doesn't.
It's a good political answer.
Well, no, it's the truth.
Just kidding.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to Detonation Point presented by Elastio. If you like this episode, please comment, good, bad, and different. We like to see those. Subscribe, share to your friends, share to your enemies, and we will see you next time.